In the previous video, you were introduced to the concept of pattern recognition, and how it is at the basis of recognizing the fulfillment of a prophecy, based on the criteria established by the prophecy. The three elements of recognizing that a prophecy has been fulfilled is, quote, 1. Prediction. A prophecy involved making predictions about future events or outcomes, often with a level of specificity. 2. Fulfillment. When events unfold in a way that aligns with the predictions of a prophecy, people may recognize patterns between the prophecy and the events, leading to a sense of fulfillment. And 3. Pattern recognition. The recognition of the fulfillment of a prophecy involved observing the alignment between the predicted events and the actual events, which is a form of pattern recognition based on the established criteria of the prophecy. End quote. Concerning the prophecies of Revelation 16, all of the prophecies were laid out exegetically, on the historical timeline and dated with astronomical dating, as instructed by John, prefacing his work in the book, in Revelation chapter 1 verse 20. Quote, "The mystery of the 7 stars which thou saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the messengers of the 7 ecclesia, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 ecclesia." End quote. The historicist interpretation, which is the only one there really is, with John's instructed astronomical dating, which was intentionally suppressed by the Vatican in the Theodosius Codex, gave us the following historical timeline that you now see on your screen. In the first judgment, John prophesied there would be painful skin sores, as a result of sun worship, taking the mark of the beast, and kissing his icon. That historically occurred in 1806. In the second judgment, John prophesied seawater would become as blood. That historically began occurring in 1844. In the third judgment, John prophesied that fresh water would also become as blood. That historically began occurring in 1878. In the fourth judgment, John prophesied that the heat of the sun would be increased, so that it would scorch men with fire. That began occurring in 1911. Next, in Armageddon, John prophesied it would unexpectedly come as a thief in the night. That occurred in 1918. Next, we come to the fifth saucer judgment, which is the plague of darkness, which is scheduled for approximately the year 2034. And then, we come to the sixth judgment, which is next to the final judgment of the set, which is the drying up of the Euphrates River, which is also prophetically scheduled for the year 2052. Before the final seventh judgment of a record-breaking earthquake in Rome, followed by what is known today as mega hail. What we have seen once again from our study of Revelation 16, using the historical or instructed interpretation with astronomical dating, that John's 7 saucer judgments have already mostly occurred, with the exception of only really 2 more judgments, that being the 5th judgment and the 7th judgment. In that the Euphrates River prophecy or the 6th judgment is already on the event horizon and can be empirically seen as already in the process of coming to pass. And these facts have forced counter-reformationists into greater and greater efforts of deliberately lying to the public, to avoid the humiliation that they are fully following and serving the Antichrist, spoken about in the New Testament, because of their Jesuit-based eschatology. Rather than acknowledge what God has done in their midst, and repent, they prefer to engage in intentional deception, proving ultimately, their final allegiance is not to Christ, but to Rome. Still fraudulently claiming that they are faithful Christians, and even using the historically absurd claim, they are evangelicals.
Sir, you need to be born again.
I am born again.
Now, did you just say that you are Lucifer?
I am Lucifer.
Okay, define Lucifer for me.
Pure, virtuous, wholesome, innocent individual that's out to help people.
Lucifer is?
Yeah.
Say that again. Lucifer is a pure, holy...
Virtuous.
Virtuous. Now, is he the Lucifer that God created?
That's the same one.
Which, of course, as counter-reformationists, they are operating as nothing more than counter-reformation, political propagandists, for the restoration of the Roman Catholic Empire, also known as the New World Order, in political circles. They are in essence traitors, both to the same faith they fraudulently claim, and the founding fathers of America. But God has other plans for this unrepentant world, of devil worshippers who openly follow and bear witness for the Antichrist. They are going to be exposed as unfaithful servants who are made to flee God's presence, as naked and ashamed temple guards found sleeping on their watch. God has chosen how he interprets Revelation. We neither have the right or authority to interpret the book of Revelation to mean whatever we would like to make it say, as all counter-reformationist ministers of Satan incessantly claim. And the fact that God has chosen to say himself from heaven what it says, in the form of obvious reality, often frustrates and offends counter-reformationists and all those who have chosen to believe in them, because they prefer the deception they are offered, rather than admit the truth about who these impostor religious leaders actually are. Because all of the prophecies in the 7 bowl or saucer judgments, which have already occurred, and there has been no fictitious Jesuit rapture anywhere to be seen, it inevitably means the Antichrist is already present in the earth, full stop. And that these prophecies have happened over the period of the ages. It also means that the Antichrist is precisely as John claimed. It is a kingdom, whose king is the Antichrist, with a throne, which lasts in the earth throughout the ages, until Christ returns, and personally destroys, in the brightness of his coming, and casts it, and its followers, into the lake of fire. That should give every counter-reformationist pause of working for it, but instead, it simply gives them the comfort of time to pile up their ever more frequent iniquities of devil worship, idolatry, theft and spiritual prostitution. But God has other plans for the world of devil worshippers and habitual liars that they now are. As you have seen in previous videos, Revelation chapter 16, verses 13 through 16, were the references to Armageddon, explained by the same commentators as the Battle of Armageddon that had been correctly prophesied by historicist commentators since as early as 1560, and the publication of the Geneva Bible into English, that later became fulfilled in World War I and its conclusion in the Battle of Megiddo, that they correctly prophesied, down to even the details of the very principles in the war. The text was placed in between the 6th and 7th saucer judgment, but given the caveat that it would come as a thief in the night, unexpectedly, and precisely as John prophesied. The alliance between the Ottoman Empire and the Second Reich literally occurred overnight, in the cover of darkness, and kept secret until their attack on the port city of Odessa. A very unlikely alliance that had actually been prophesied for hundreds of years by historicist commentators based on the text in Revelation. But that very text produced a mystery, because every major scholar, including even among historicist commentators, took verse 12, which is the prophecy that the Euphrates would dry up, and be done so that the forces of the Battle of Megiddo would be able to cross the river without hindrance, and make their way to Megiddo for the battle. Not only did that not happen, there actually was no need to even cross the river to begin with. So that prophecy looked completely out of place, and thus why many Christians were easily persuaded to jump the ship and accept the alternate explanations provided by Jesuit futurism. It was a lazy solution, and got many preachers out of the trouble of explaining in their sermons. But when you revisit the Textus Receptus, you will discover that their shallow abandonment of the historicist interpretation was not only completely unjustified, it would constitute one of the most serious mistakes ever in the entire history of Western Protestant Christianity, literally signing its very death warrant. And not only did they literally sign their own death warrant, not only did they abandon 500 years of consistent interpretation of prophecy that was accurate, but they also abandoned the very illumination of the prophecy in verse 12, that would, given time, come to be the most incredible and obvious prophecy of all, prior to the final judgment itself. It would become the most clear, most obvious, most revealing, most prophetic of all previous 5 prophecies in the text. And they walked away from it without blinking an eye. And now they are stuck in a place of apostasy and reality denial, embracing the Antichrist and worshipping his image, also as John prophesied now they themselves would mistakenly do. But verse 12 has some very big surprises in store for apostate Protestant devil worshippers and apostates who embraced Jesuit futurism in defense of the Antichrist. And by the way, that language should not offend anyone, in that is the very language of the New Testament, and how it describes them, which most of their Masonic leaders who introduced that conversion process in Protestantism to begin with in the US, fully understand, and have no problem with, ignoring. Verse 12, prophesies much more than was realized in previous centuries by commentators. And it is prophecy that can only be understood, after understanding, the Battle of Megiddo, or Armageddon, has truly occurred. Without acknowledging what has happened, you cannot possibly know or understand what is coming. Thus why it is so important to fully admit and be transparent about what has already happened, rather than simply hide prophecies that didn't happen the way you wanted. God is the one who is doing both the speaking of the prophecies to John and the one who is fulfilling them in history. He is the interpreter of what he meant by the prophecy and how it is fulfilled. End of discussion. In verse 12, if you will simply take a second look at what the literal Greek text says, in the Textus Receptus, it has some amazingly literal facts in the text. But those nuances are simply lost in translation. The first nuance, which we have already pointed out in our translation, is that the phrase, Kings of the East, is an attempt at a translation which actually doesn't even need to be translated, because there is a reference in that phrase to a very important geographical location if it is just simply left literal in the text. This is not the first time we have seen translators make that serious mistake. The geographical location is known today as Anatolia. You can see it used in the Greek right there in the Greek interlinear above. It is the Greek word Anatole, but there is much more coming. Anatolia is the region that was referred to in the Turkish Empire, which also was called the Ottoman Empire, who was the very unlikely ally of the German Second Reich in World War I that had been prophesied to happen. So, Anatolia was definitely in the prophecy of Armageddon. But the question is, how on earth does the sixth prophecy fit into the prophecy of Armageddon? The answer is, the sixth saucer is about the aftermath of Armageddon and the future going forward, not as an access point to the battle. It is logical to assume, if you ignore the caution by John, that his prophecy concerning Armageddon will come as a surprise, and therefore be non-chronological, or not in sequence. It makes the sixth judgment look as though it is a precursor to Armageddon. But John has already told his audience not to expect that. If you look on a map, Anatolia is a region that actually doesn't need to cross the Euphrates to get to Armageddon, and it didn't. But somehow, all these commentators failed to connect the dots that the Ottoman Empire would never need a river crossing on the Euphrates as a military access point. And furthermore, if you actually look at the literal Greek text, you will find something that no previous commentators could probably have imagined, but there it is, anyway, as plain as day. And it comes from the structure of the text in Greek, not its translation. That is why it is lost in translation, beyond just the fact that Anatolia is mistranslated out of existence in the English translations. If you look back up to the Greek interlinear at the phrase tone, apo, anatolon, helios, which means literally from the Anatolian sun, that is customarily translated as meaning from the east. But that is not what it literally says, and anyone that translates it into that has to assume that the literal text is not the actual intended reference. And that is a serious translation mistake. Because the literal text just says, from the Anatolian sun. It sounds a little weird. How can something be from the Anatolian sun? How can kings be from the Anatolian sun? But John is not referencing the kings. Most commentators mistakenly apply the meaning of the phrase to refer to its previous phrase about the kings or kingdoms, which they also assume is from the east, because of the word Anatolon, which one of its meanings is east. But the other meaning also means east, but is an actual reference without translation. But the reference to the phrase from the Anatolian sun is not just a reference to its precedent clause, as to the kings, it is a summary reference to the entire sentence and the main event of the prophecy, that the Euphrates River will dry up. As you see in the Greek text above, he says, ex arende, ta, udor, o2, which means, dried the water of it. You can actually see what John is making a reference to, dried the water of it, from the Anatolian sun. Read that again, dried the water of it, from the Anatolian sun. And that is exactly what you now see happening. It is being dried up, because of the Anatolian sun. So how does the subject or issue of the kings come into this prophecy? Dried the water of it, from the Anatolian sun. So, the question becomes, how does this prepare the way for the kings? Now, you are beginning to see what the real prophecy of the actual Textus Receptus is really telling us. It is not just a prophecy that the river will dry up because of the heat from the sun, and that when this happens, this event will prepare the way for the kings of Anatolia. Now, let's dig into this even a little deeper. When the Ottoman Empire, which is Anatolia, lost in the liberation of Jerusalem, and lost its subsequent Battle of Megiddo, and surrendered. Shortly after the demise of the Ottoman Empire, the last Caliphate of the Ottoman Empire resigned, as did the king of the German Reich. The royalty in Anatolia, which was called the Ottoman Empire, were not called kings, as they were in the West. They were called caliphates. Caliphates were the heads of both the Islamic religion and the state. The resignation and loss of the caliphate from the Islamic world has long been a sore spot for political Islam. And what John is actually prophesying is that the drying up of the Euphrates will mark a return of the Anatolian caliphates. But how, and why, is it going to happen? John has already prophesied this very event. The Euphrates River will be dried by the Anatolian sun, and the drying of the Euphrates River by the sun will prepare the way for the return of the caliphates. And that is John's actual prophecy in the Textus Receptus. And it is very literal to the actual text itself. And it is with a very minimalistic need of any translation whatsoever. But it is a potentially ominous prophecy for the Western world. And it will happen as sure as the drying of the Euphrates River. And it will, precisely as John prophesied, prepare the way for this development. In fact, it is already doing just that. But how is it going to prepare the way for the caliphates to return to power? That is precisely what you will discover next. The New World Order and the Antichrist. As has been repeatedly pointed out in previous videos, the actual identification of the Antichrist has never changed from what it was 5 centuries ago. What has changed is the actual small number of Protestant Christians or evangelicals who are still Protestant Christian or evangelical. And what has replaced them is no longer Protestant Christian or evangelical. But nothing has changed inside the Bible that very clearly points out what the Antichrist is, which can be very easily seen by the relatively small number of knowledgeable and sincere Christians who have actually studied the Bible. Because of the multiple texts that continually and unmistakably point him out throughout the New Testament. And there is a direct historical relationship between the Antichrist and the New World Order. A previous pope did allude to the term New World Order in the context of global affairs and even went so far as to even describe it in an encyclical. Pope John XXIII, who served as pope from 1958 to 1963, alluded to the term in his encyclical Pax Amituris, which was published in 1963. In this encyclical, Pope John XXIII begins the text with the statement, quote, "Peace on earth, which man throughout the ages has so longed for, and sought after, can never be established, never guaranteed, except by the diligent observance of the divinely established order." End quote. The papacy saw itself as the divinely established order. And that is what the New World Order, actually, really, refers to. All of the disinformation being floated by conspiracy theorists who are most often Catholic themselves, are usually intentional cover stories, employed for that very New World Order they themselves are demonizing and decrying. Knowing full well, all along, as a Catholic, it was actually a Vatican political and global design. And even openly referenced by multiple popes, going back many decades. And because of that, there is absolutely no way these same Catholic conspiracy theorists, or even Republican conspiracy theorists, can plead ignorance, and would not know whose it is, and where it came from. Along with the canonized Pope John Paul, the term New World Order was also used by President George H.W. Bush in his September 11, 1990 speech. This speech was delivered shortly after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. In his speech, President Bush outlined his vision for a post-Cold War international system, characterized by cooperation among nations, the rule of law, and the promotion of democracy and free markets. This vision is often referred to as the New World Order. It's important to note that President Bush's speech was a reflection of the prevailing optimism at the time, as the world was transitioning from the bipolarity of the Cold War to a new era. The term New World Order referred to a vision of global cooperation and stability. However, part of the use of global institutions, which he outlined ambiguously, was the assimilation of the Vatican as an equal partner in the global management of society, largely for their assistance and shared intelligence gathering in bringing about the fall of the Soviet Union, which they were ultimately instrumental in doing. As the Vatican thus acquired the political asset of the former Protestant United States, all of its own institutions went through a Catholic assimilation or conversion process in the Americas, transforming America, politically and religiously, into a Latin American hemisphere bloc, including the religious institutions of American academia. Even their denominational creeds and confessions of faith all began to systematically delete any reference to the papacy as the Antichrist from their organizing and founding documents, because they were all, metaphorically, in bed with that same Antichrist that had been spelled out in their own founding confessions of faith and creeds. Those deletions and revisions were being attributed to not being clear about who the Antichrist really was, based entirely on the influence of Jesuit futurism and preterism, neither of which were even valid biblical eschatologies. And these are the very same eschatologies that were entirely rejected, historically, as non-Christian by all their own original founders. And those original founders and confessors were right. It wasn't Christian eschatology. As the Vatican began waging its extremely successful counter-Reformation political war on the previous American vision of liberal Western democracies with separation of church and state, one of the inevitable outgrowths would be the same rejection of that model of modern democracy in the Islamic world. Many of the previous countries had various versions of democracies that grew out of America's dominant influence in the world after World War I and II. But now that America itself had become a full partner of the Vatican and a premier Catholic state for global political power, Islamic countries themselves were now challenging the idea that their governments should be following the model of Western modern democracies, which were being phased out in favor of extreme right authoritarian governance after the authoritarian hierarchical model of the Vatican. Previous to World War II, commonly known as fascism. As prophesied by John, the drying of the Euphrates River would mark the rise of the Anatolian Caliphates. The result of this American abandonment of liberal Western democracy had an extreme impact in the Muslim world, and eventually grew into something called ISIS, which stands for the Islamic State, in Iraq and Syria. And their chief methodology of that change would be the use of violence, in the form of horrific terrorism, suicide bombing, and the intentional display of a savage, medieval barbarism, including beheadings by sword. And that is what you will see next. The New World Order is just the Old World Order without the Protestant United States. There is actually nothing new about it, other than the modern technology in it that the Vatican actually had nothing to do with. When Pope Francis traveled to areas of Iraq and Africa, which were security areas that were seriously compromised with ISIS terrorists, Pope Francis traveled without fear and minimal security into these areas. Most Americans could not imagine why the papacy was not at serious risk in these travels. What most Americans, however, did not realize is that the Vatican had had a very long previous history with Islamic terrorism, reaching all the way back to its historical source and training. Muslims treated the visit of the papacy with greater respect than even other Muslims received in those same areas. When Pope Francis arrived, A throng of Muslims crowded the street of his motorcade to get a glimpse of him, and not a soul in the crowd, filled with devout and even radicalized Muslims, were a threat. Even though they were busy blowing up each other's mosques with suicide bombers. As was covered in this channel's earlier topic on terrorism, terrorism was imported into Islam from the Irish Republican Army. All of the technology and bomb-building skills, which were given to Islamic terrorists, came from training and materials provided by the Irish Republican Army for terrorism in the Middle East. And for the most part, it was used to target more Muslims in the Middle East than even Christians or even Jews. The justification for the slaughter was that the Hadiths taught it was justified to kill a Muslim, if you had to, in order to kill an infidel standing behind them. So, self-slaughter among other Muslims was encouraged. And the source of all that came directly from the Vatican. So, Pope Francis rightly suspected he had nothing to fear from his own terrorists. The rejection, by the papal, New World Order, of the freedom of religion within a secular state model advocated by the previous Protestant America led numerous countries into conflict for a dominance by religious groups in a power vacuum, which resulted in an assimilation of strict regressive government policies in the realm of religion. Many of these laws are couched in modern terms that hide their actual application, explained in the article entitled National Laws on Blasphemy, India. Quote, as a home to numerous religious and ethnic groups, India has a number of laws against hate speech that fall under the reasonable restrictions to freedom of expression permitted in the Indian Constitution. Specifically, Sections 124A, 153A, 153B, 292, 293, and 295A of the Indian Penal Code prohibit any words or representations that insult any individual's or group's religious beliefs, or that are meant to incite enmity against a particular religion. The punishment for hate speech is a fine, imprisonment for up to 3 years, or both. Members of all of India's faith groups can and do utilize anti-hate speech legislation when their religious sensibilities are hurt. Recent arrests include newspaper editors for articles criticizing the public nudity of certain Jain monks, and arguing for the right to critique any religion, the latter of which angered Muslims. Unprosecuted complaints have been filed by Buddhists against an actress who posed nude against a Buddha statue, and by Hindus against an athlete who ate beef during a cricket match. End quote. An atheist who dared to suggest there was a natural explanation for Catholic idols that appeared to be bleeding actually had to flee to another country because of the blasphemy laws that prohibited any criticism of the practice of idolatry in India. The idea of a return of theocratic authoritarian states is not a new idea. That is how the majority of the world has always been governed up until the modern era. And the return of these ideas is nothing new. It is actually a return to the Dark Ages of medieval Europe. And all the old ways of thinking about human rights and post-Reformation freedom of evangelical liberty, openly condemned in the 1911 papal encyclical of the editae saepe, are also now returning under the visible judgment of God. And it is the impostors in America that claim the mantle of American evangelicals who are spearheading this global disaster, which is nothing less than a full embrace by the world of the Antichrist, under their very leadership and financial and material support to do so.
If you look at the history, just very briefly, look at the history, actually, Islam has been unique in that sense, that it's never had a clergy. It's only with modern Islamism, the Iranian Revolution, for example, was unique that it reintroduced the idea of a politicized clergy that were ruling in God's name. Whereas before Khomeini, the Shiite Muslims, or 20% of the world's Muslims, believed that no man had the right to rule in God's name until the Messiah returned. As for the 80% who are Sunnis, they've never had a clergy. For their entire history. And so modern-day Islamism is attempting to bring about the very thing it despises, which is Western Catholicism before the Reformation. I refer to Islamism as the bastard child of colonialism. Frankly, that's what it is. So modern-day Islamism is attempting to bring about the very thing it despises, which is Western Catholicism before the Reformation.
A caliphate is a political and religious concept in Islam, referring to an Islamic state, led by a caliph, who is considered a successor to the Prophet Muhammad, and holds both temporal and spiritual authority. The term caliphate comes from the Arabic word khalifa, which means successor or representative. The caliph serves as both a political leader, guiding the state's governance and administration, and a religious leader, upholding and interpreting Islamic Sharia law, and promoting the values of Islamic faith. The concept of the caliphate emerged shortly after the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE. The first four caliphs, known as the Rashidun caliphs, were chosen from among his close companions, and played a crucial role in the early expansion and organization of the Islamic community, also known as the Ummah. The caliphate evolved over time, with different dynasties and empires, establishing their own caliphal systems, such as the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, and others. The Anatolian Caliphate began with the Ottomans, starting from their conquest of Egypt in 1517, and gradually gained control over the Hejaz region, which includes the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. By controlling these sacred sites, the Ottoman sultans claimed the title of caliph, presenting themselves as the spiritual leaders of the entire Muslim world. The formal declaration of the Ottoman Sultan as the caliph happened in 1517 when Sultan Selim I conquered Egypt and took the title of caliph. The Ottomans used the caliphate as a way to legitimize their rule over a diverse range of Muslim populations in their empire. The caliphate was not just a religious position, but also held political significance, as it helped consolidate Ottoman authority over different regions and provided a sense of unity among Muslims under their rule. However, it's important to note that the Ottoman Caliphate was not universally accepted by all Muslims. Some Sunni Muslim scholars and communities recognized the Ottoman Sultan as the caliph, while others, particularly the Shiite Muslims, did not. Because of this division of opinion, the caliphate's authority was challenged over time, and it was ultimately abolished as part of Turkey's transformation into a modern secular state after World War I. In 1924, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, abolished the caliphate as part of his efforts to establish a secular republic. This marked the end of the Ottoman Caliphate and the official connection between political leadership and religious authority. However, due to the New World Order's conservative bent toward the establishment of theocracies governed by authoritarian religious dogmas and doctrines, the 20th and 21st centuries saw a parallel revival of the idea of an Islamic caliphate. Various Islamic movements and groups have repeatedly called for the restoration of the caliphate, often with differing interpretations and methods. Some of these movements include the Muslim Brotherhood and jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It's important to note that while some movements have sought to restore the caliphate as a unifying force in the Muslim world, the interpretations and methods employed have varied widely. Some advocate for a peaceful and spiritual leadership, while others promote violent means to establish a caliphate under their own strict interpretation of Islam. The idea of returning or re-establishing caliphates in the modern context is rooted in a desire among some members of the Islamic world for unity, strength, and a centralized leadership that represents their shared faith and cultural identity. Here are some reasons why some individuals or groups within the Islamic world have wanted the caliphates to be returned. 1. Religious significance. Many Muslims view the caliphate as an important religious institution that helps maintain the unity and purity of the faith. The caliph is seen as a spiritual guide and protector of Islamic values. 2. Political unity. The concept of a caliphate provides a means to unify the diverse and geographically dispersed Muslim populations under a single leadership, potentially strengthening their political influence on the global stage. 3. Cultural identity. The caliphate can serve as a symbol of shared heritage and identity among Muslims, transcending national borders and fostering a sense of community. 4. Islamic law and justice. A caliphate, based on Islamic principles, could offer a platform for the implementation of Sharia law, which some Muslims believe would lead to a more just and equitable society. Sharia law would require a return to the zakat, religious tax, and a repression of the role of Muslim females, among other regressions from medieval society. 5. colonial legacy. The dissolution of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924 marked the end of the last widely recognized caliphate. Some individuals perceived the colonial powers of the 20th century as having undermined Muslim unity and sovereignty, and they seek to restore the caliphate as a form of resistance against perceived Western domination, while at the same time erroneously thinking that the papacy, which is the very embodiment of colonial Western power, is the perfect vehicle for those very aspirations. And this explains their support of the papacy, despite their Islamic faith. The call for a caliphate intersect with authoritarianism and a return to the Dark Ages in the papal New World Order in the following ways. 1. Authoritarian interpretations of the caliphate. Some proponents of the caliphate envision a centralized, all-encompassing Islamic state that enforces a strict interpretation of Sharia law. In such cases, the caliphate would operate with a top-down authoritarian approach, curbing individual freedoms and dissenting voices in the name of upholding religious purity, much like the current Ayatollah does among Shiite Muslims of Iran. 2. Anti-Western sentiment. Certain calls for a caliphate are accompanied by anti-Western and anti-imperialist sentiments, viewing Western influence and values as incompatible with Islamic principles. These views are aligned with authoritarian tendencies and a desire to assert exclusive control over domestic and global affairs to counter perceived Western dominance. 3. Rejection of national borders. The concept of a caliphate often challenges existing nation-states and their borders, which were largely drawn during colonial times. Some proponents argue that a caliphate should transcend these borders, potentially leading to conflicts with established governments. The rejection of existing political structures contribute to destabilization of societies and authoritarian policies. 4. Struggle for global dominance. Certain groups advocating for a caliphate aspire to establish a global Islamic order based on their interpretation of Islam. In this vision, they seek to challenge the existing international order and promote their exclusive values worldwide, potentially clashing with democratic and pluralistic nations. 5. Jihadist and extremist elements. While not representative of all caliphate advocates, some extremist groups use the concept of the caliphate to advance their extremist agendas. These groups often employ violent means to establish their version of a caliphate, which involve authoritarian control and suppression of dissent. 6. Challenges to secularism. The concept of a caliphate clash with secular governance models. Some proponents view secularism as incompatible with Islam and seek to replace secular governments with religious authority. This can lead to authoritarian measures to suppress secular voices and institutions. This is where the interests of militant Islam intersect with the Vatican, who is also attempting to replace secular governments with a medieval, Catholic model of state theocracy through the implementation of canon law. 7. Geopolitical ambitions. The call for a caliphate can also be tied to geopolitical ambitions and aspirations for regional or global dominance. In some cases, these ambitions may drive authoritarian regimes to use religious rhetoric to legitimize their actions and consolidate political power. 8. Use of terrorism and violence. A subset of caliphate proponents resort to terrorism and violence to achieve their goals. Their actions are often characterized by authoritarian and extremist tendencies, challenging established world order norms, and seeking to disrupt geopolitical stability as a goal in itself. While some proponents align with authoritarian views to challenge the existing world order, many Muslims reject extremism and violence, and advocate for peaceful coexistence, social justice, and the observance of human rights within the framework of their Islamic faith. But these benevolent Muslims are having as much luck on their end with pseudo-Islam than real Christians are having here in the West with their papal-inspired version of pseudo-Christian evangelicals. The caliphates were not a creation of the Islam found in the Quran. It was created after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The countdown to the sixth saucer judgment. As you saw previously, the structure of the text in Revelation chapter 16, verse 12, is lost in translation, which actually literally reads, quote, dried the water of it, from the Anatolian sun, to prepare the way for royalty. End quote. This additional information is a huge clarification about what the sixth saucer judgment is really prophesying. Even though the prophecy of the sixth saucer judgment is still to be culminated in a future event, all of its main prophesied events have already reached the event horizon and can be empirically seen as future developments, including the rise of the royalty of Anatolia, which is translated, erroneously, as the kings of the East. Anatolia is mentioned in John's text in relationship to the drying up of the Euphrates River, naturally, because Anatolia was known since ancient times to be the actual source of the Euphrates River. So his text in its historical context makes perfect linguistic and grammatical sense. If the river were to dry up, it would naturally occur at its source, and be, because of the sun, that he has continually been prophesying a series of events in relation to. Because it mentions specifically Anatolia, and we know from history, the royalty of Anatolia were called the Caliphates, and we know that the text is actually prophesying when the Euphrates River dries up, the way for the Caliphates of Anatolia will be prepared. So now that we have seen what the Caliphates actually were, now we are going to see why the drying up of the Euphrates River will prepare the way for their return. Quote, the city of Erzurum is located in what is actually called Anatolian Turkey. The Anatolian city of Erzurum is often considered to be one of the closest major cities to the source of the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River originates from two main tributaries, the Murat River and the Karsa River, both of which arise in the mountains near Erzurum. The exact point of origin can be found in the remote region of Bengal Mountains, which is not far from Erzurum. End quote. On October 22, 2019, the 116th Congress First Sessions Committee on Foreign Relations for the United States Senate held a hearing entitled, Assessing the Impact of Turkey's Offensive in Northeast Syria. In the hearing, David Phillips, of Columbia University, and who was a foreign affairs expert with a long list of expertise testified. His resume included being, quote, the current director of the Program on Peace Building and Rights at Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. He was a senior advisor to the United Nations Secretariat, and as a foreign affairs expert and senior advisor to the U.S. Department of State. He held positions as a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Center for Middle East Studies, and the executive director of Columbia University's International Conflict Resolution Program, and also the director of the Program on Conflict Prevention and Peace Building at the American University, associate professor at New York University's Department of Politics, and a professor at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. Previously he served as a senior fellow and deputy director of the Council on Foreign Relations Center for Preventive Action, and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council of the United States, senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and director of the European Center for Common Ground, and project director at the International Peace Research Institute of Oslo, as well as president of the Congressional Human Rights Foundation, and the executive director of the Elie Wiesel Foundation. David Phillips is also the author of many published books and reports on foreign policy, as well as more than 100 featured articles in such publications as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, International Herald Tribune, and Foreign Affairs. End quote. A link of this congressional report will be provided in the video's description section below. For the Senate hearing, Phillips presented a 42-point report detailing documented evidence that Turkey, while continuously issuing official denials, had actually been a backdoor sponsor of ISIS in Iraq. Turkey's material support included training, weapons and recruitment. This was deeply disturbing to many lawmakers, because ISIS fighters made use of grotesque acts of horrific terrorism, including the sanctioned raping of women, beheading of men, and the killing of children, to establish an Islamic caliphate. And ISIS activities also included such things as the bombing of mosques and the indiscriminate killing of other Muslims, many of whom were allies of the United States and seeking a free democracy for their country. The political tragedy of this hearing was that the very politicians who were the most vocal in their rhetoric about their opposition to ISIS terrorism, to the extremes of bordering on violations of constitutional law, against even victimized Muslims, they were hypocritically silent when it came to Turkey's transparent effort to support, sponsor, train and supply ISIS's effort to establish an Islamic Caliphate for Turkey. Why the sudden silence when it came to Turkey? Quote, Turkey has been putting special emphasis on pushing forward Erdogan's agenda of establishing the caliphate through the world, by sending Turkish TV serials dubbed in vernacular languages to the Muslim nations. According to reliable sources, Turkey has been offering its TV serials to the Muslim nations at almost no price. The notorious agenda is pushing Recep Tayyip Erdogan's ambition of establishing the Ottoman Caliphate throughout the world. Most of these Turkish serials promote radical Islam, which would leave a serious impact on the minds of the younger generation in particular. While the majority of the drama and TV content production companies in Bangladesh are other Muslim nations, and are becoming increasingly worried at the massive invasion of the number of Turkish TV serials on the television channels, radical Muslims are feeling delighted as they consider these serials as one of the best methods of injecting radical Islam and jihadism within the minds of the people. End quote. On the website of Frontier Alliance International's website, on July 26, 2020, the Frontier Alliance International website did a video entitled Turkish Caliphate Rising, the Revival of the Original Islamic State. The video was produced by Dalton Thomas, who is a Christian and co-founder of Maranatha, which is a global fellowship of churches and ministries. Thomas Dalton lived previously in northern Iraq, among the Kurds, and is familiar with what is really going on with Turkey's involvement in sponsoring the effort to establish an Islamic Caliphate. Dalton squarely identifies the effort to be originating in the aspirations for the restoration of the Turkish Caliphate. His analysis of Turkey's aspirations for a revived caliphate is from first-hand experience on the ground in the region, which was previously in history, geographically, an extension of eastern Anatolia. What is inspiring this movement in the Muslim world is the often repeated eschatological expectations that before the judgment day arises, the caliphate would be restored. One of the major events in that expectation is what is currently happening to the Euphrates River. In the chapter, A Hadith about Dajjal and Portents of the Hour, the Riyad Salihin, Book 18, Hadith 15, states, quote, Abu Hurairah, may Allah be pleased with him, the Messenger of Allah said, the hour will not come to pass before the river Euphrates dries up. Another narration is, the time is near when the river Euphrates will dry up. End quote. There is another prediction that upon the drying of the Euphrates, a mountain of gold will be revealed, but many commentators take the reference to gold as symbolic of something very valuable. These hadiths are also tied to the eschatological expectation of the revival of a caliphate. In the Hadith of the 12 Caliphs, this hadith is found in Sahih Muslim and other hadith collections, and states that there will be 12 caliphs after the Prophet Muhammad. Some Muslims, who believe in the return of a caliphate, associate this hadith with the idea that a righteous and just caliphate will emerge in the future. In the Hadith of the Mahdi, the concept of the Mahdi, or Guided One, is widespread in Islamic eschatology. Various hadiths describe the Mahdi as a just and righteous leader who will emerge in the end times, to fill the world with justice and equity. Some Muslims associate the return of a caliphate with the appearance of the Mahdi. In the hadiths about the signs of the hour, there are numerous hadiths that describe signs that will precede the day of judgment. Some of these signs are believed to be the reappearance of a caliphate, the unearthing of the Ark of the Covenant, and the return of Prophet Jesus, called Isa, as a just ruler. In Islamic eschatological literature, besides hadiths, there are other Islamic texts and writings that discuss the signs of the end times and the return of a caliphate. These texts may come from scholars and theologians who have analyzed and compiled various hadiths and Quranic verses on the topic. These prophecies are taken seriously by many Muslims, and are believed to be signs of the imminent arrival of the Day of Judgment. However, it is important to note that interpretations of these prophecies can vary among different Islamic scholars and communities. Some may interpret them more literally, while others may see them as symbolic or metaphorical. Additionally, some Muslims do attach specific expectations of the return of a caliphate to the prophecies mentioned in Islamic texts, particularly in relation to the end times. It's important to note that interpretations of these prophecies and the expectations of a return of a caliphate can vary significantly among different Muslim scholars and communities. Some view these prophecies as symbolic or metaphorical, while others may interpret them more literally and anticipate the emergence of a specific political entity resembling the historical caliphates. Additionally, there have been various movements and individuals throughout history who claim to be caliphs, or sought to establish a caliphate based on their interpretations of these prophecies. However, currently, the Muslim world remains diverse, and not all Muslims share the same views or interpretations regarding the specifics of these prophecies and their relation to the return of a caliphate. Among Muslims who do have specific expectations regarding the return of a caliphate and its association with prophecies, they often cite various hadiths and other texts found in Islamic literature. These hadiths are considered important sources of guidance and knowledge for Muslims, and they contain various prophecies related to the end times and the return of a caliphate. Eschatologically speaking, the drying of the Euphrates River marked the time, among Islamic believers in these prophecies, that the caliphate will be restored. The amazing thing about these expectations is that the Muslim world have no idea what is really in the Textus Receptus, because the only Christianity they have ever been exposed to is either Catholicism or Jesuit futurism eschatology that intentionally hides the content of Revelation from the public. And the prophecy about the Euphrates River does not indicate the return of the Anatolian Caliphate will be a good one. It is called the Sixth Saucer Judgment against the Antichrist, by John. It will happen, but it will be no more good for the world than melanoma, red tide, global warming, or the potential coming geosolar storm blackout. As happened in the previous Middle Ages, as countries aligned themselves with the Vatican's policies of kings and theocracies, Europe was sent into the Dark Ages. And it took centuries before Europe ever recovered from that regression into the vast ignorance and superstition of the Dark Ages. Before the Reformation paved the way for secular governments to come into existence, in the form of the American Revolution, granting religious freedom. Everyone, from Muslims to, and including Roman Catholics themselves, benefited from the granting of that kind of freedom under secular democratic government. It was a bold progressive idea of human rights, and fought every step of the way by the papacy, having on its past resume. They fought against outlawing the Inquisitions, they fought against the abolition of slavery, they fought against the suffrage of women, all the way up into modern time, with their fight against legal accountability of priests for the rape of women and children. If American leaders think God is going to bless America by giving up its sovereignty to the Antichrist to gain more political power for its apostate religious leaders, America is in for a very, very bad awakening in the Sixth Saucer Judgment. Because, along with all the other very bad global disasters that will be brought on by the embrace of the Antichrist by the world, the Sixth Saucer Judgment will affect what America is hoping to gain from in its alliance with the Antichrist. Neither will there be global peace, as anticipated in exchange for this betrayal of the idea of America's founders for the establishment of a secular government, but what will happen next will shock all the political talking points and predictions of the experts, who will be filled with nothing but propaganda lies and false assurances prior to this time. The current border problem, with masses of immigration from Latin America to the border of the United States, has one very simple solution, and nothing political even needs to be done to reform immigration. Just evangelize the immigrants. If you don't like out-of-control immigration happening on the southern border, all any Republican or Democrat would ever have to do is simply begin evangelizing the immigrants, and openly inform them that the papacy is the biblical Antichrist. And as soon as you do this, those throngs of crowds will very quickly disappear overnight, because the Catholic Church will stop organizing the bus rides to come, and offering free housing along the way, to get them here. Because it will not be in their own interests to do so any longer. Catholic Immigration Services have their eyes on the intentional manipulation of America's population demographics. And as long as we incentivize them, and actually pay them, to do this, they never will stop the influx. And that is why Republicans and Democrats, really, want nothing passed. Right now, American evangelicals have put the New World Order, Vatican, in the driver's seat, politically and financially, receiving over $2 billion every year, in taxpayer funds, that are never tracked for any purpose. It is a blank check written out every year, by the American government, to the label of Catholic Charities, or, in other words, to the Antichrist. There is no accountability of its recipients, for where any of it actually goes. No other religion in America gets such preferential treatment, despite the fact Roman Catholicism was only 17% of the population in the U.S. prior to these immigrations, but is currently been brought up to 24%. Eventually it will be brought up to above 50%, if not changed, which is the demographic goal of the Vatican. But when Republicans complain about it, they are complaining about what they themselves have voted to do. Concerning the papacy and the prophetic events of chapter 16, verse 12. Progressively, political ups and downs will inevitably occur with the Islamic world and the papacy. The papacy will continue to be embraced by them, since it was an ally in World War I, and the source of its training and materials for its campaigns of terrorism. The Vatican will be politically obliged to assist the Islamic world in its effort to revive an Islamic caliphate, now that it has come into its full power. Step by step, creating trust from the Islamic world, it will slowly take efforts, and give signs, to the Caliphate parties, that it will support the concept politically, behind the scenes. But, their continuous duplicity, will ultimately betray them, and cause the Caliphate parties, to turn, once again, on the Christendom, that the papacy has successfully seduced into its orbit. And the entire papal, New World Order, enterprise, will go down in the very flames it had previously fanned. As the very signs in the heavens will actually point to the very same attempt of the popular current Pope Francis to offer appeasement to the Islamic militants over the restoration of an Islamic caliphate. According to John's prophecy, the royalty of Anatolia will become the new scourge of the earth for everyone, including Muslims, and create in particular a very, very dangerous situation not only for the Vatican, but Americans who now live in a nation which has hitched the economic and political fortunes of its own wagon to the power economics of the Vatican, which will now become an increasing burden to the world economically. When you look at the insignias of the two powers, each display two prominent astronomical symbols. For the Vatican, it is the sun, which emblazons the current Pope's coat of arms, and the Jesuit order from which he came. It is also a prominent symbol of Roman Catholicism that spreads the religious solar ritual of sun worship, offered to the world, as Christ Mass, an observance of its holy day, held weekly, on Sunday. Referred to by Constantine, who began the sun worship in Rome, as the Venerable Day of the Sun. In opposition to that symbol, is the symbol of Caliphate Islam, which was the moon. Why the Caliphates chose this symbol is often debated. Some say, it is because of Muhammad. Others point to the fact, the crescent and star, had a very long pagan history, centuries before it was adopted by the Caliphates. But it was chosen by Caliphate Islam, and its use was prominently displayed on historical flags, for state functions, and battles. The prophecy in verse 12, is prophesying the coming of a dominance of the Anatolian royalty, over what John is prophesying about in Rome. The two parties are the Anatolian Caliphate, and the Roman Antichrist. Both are described in negative terms. So there is no one to cheer for, in this clash. And we are certainly warned by John, against any alliance with the Antichrist. America's original posture, toward any European religion, was precisely correct to begin with, in the original U.S. Constitution. And it never should have been intentionally violated. But we did. And not only did we violate it, we did it in a spectacular fashion, in blazing fire, of open betrayal, which relegated the sealing of our future fortunes, to the fortunes of the one character in history. It openly damns to hell, and prophesies inevitable misery, despair and regret. And words, which never find the honest mouths of any pseudo-Christian preachers in America. Whatever has sought the comfort of the Roman Empire and its Pontifex Maximus, will not only not find any salvation whatsoever, it will also find, on the contrary, certain future sorrow and calamity to come from this day forward in history. When we look at the astronomical event in the heavens, we see that it occurs on March 1, 2052, at 7:27 a.m., which is 29 years from today. Because it is a prophecy, we will not know what events will transpire. But we can clearly see the sun is being crowned by the moon, in Aquarius, with Saturn, or Kronos, which is the crown. The crown, astronomically speaking, is being taken from the sun, and given to the moon. This marks the shift in global power and dominance, and it will be the result of the hand of God, and will come upon the earth as a direct punishment. On March 1, 2052, we can expect to see all of the developments that are already underway to be fulfilled, as the prophecy of the drying of the Euphrates River and the coming of the royalty of Anatolia, in verse 12. Among Islamic believers in the Caliphate, there are also other eschatological expectations, which are very dark and fantastical, which logistically cannot even happen. Other eschatological fantasies would require the killing of most of the people on earth, but it is described in opposite speak terms, like compassion and justice and equity. One of the people these fantasies would require to be killed would be the Pope. And not just the immediate Pope, but the office itself, because when you kill one Pope, there are still 1.3 billion people left, still here to replace him, a day later. When you track the interaction of Islam with Jesuit futurism, you will discover it has also been intentionally infected by the influence of Jesuit futurism, and much of their eschatology is just as unrealistic and fantastical as their Christian counterparts, because when you track the history of it, much of it can be traced to the very same sources of influence that neither were supposed to have, but in the end, actually do. An unknown source commonly attributed to Albert Einstein once said, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing, but expecting different results." That is neither the actual definition of insanity, nor anything Albert Einstein ever said, but it is self-evidently a common truism. And in the case of doing all the things in history that led to the Dark Ages, and expecting a different result, would definitely qualify as insane by the definition. And yet, that is precisely what America's evangelicals and its apostate religious leaders have counseled the whole world to now do. You have just seen the prophetic events of the coming historic fulfillment of the sixth saucer judgment, dated approximately to the year 2052. The coming of the Anatolian Caliphate will be a plague or scourge on society, as it has already been for even Muslims in the region. It is not teaching of Islam, which comes from the Quran. The inspiration of these teaching came hundreds of years after the life of Muhammad, and Caliphate Islam has two different sets of hadiths that they accept, both containing hundreds of thousands of medieval conflicting traditions, all attributed to remembering exactly what Muhammad said or did, all from people that never even saw or heard him centuries later. Kind of like Americans are told George Washington admitted he chopped down a cherry tree to his father because he could never tell a lie. A statement supposedly remembered by his biographer. But the act of American evangelicals purposely hiding the Antichrist is no different than Turkish Muslims who are hiding training and support to militant Caliphate SIM. And in fact, the two are very related, and the Pope's appeasement over the issue of militant Caliphatism will end, inevitably, in the Caliphate turning against the Vatican. And now you have to ask yourself, why are all these preachers, who are constantly speaking on texts in Revelation, never bother to mention the actual grammar and language of the original texts that never match, or even mention the concocted Jesuit fantasies they erroneously call end-time prophecy? And while they can never figure out who the Antichrist ever is, one thing is very certain for them: they are absolutely sure it's never the most mentioned personality on the entire earth, in the entire history of Western civilization, or in biblical Protestant Reformation Christianity. They are absolutely sure of that. despite the glaring contradiction of hypocrisy it poses over certainty. And, despite the fact that the very denominations they are affiliated with all had to go back and delete the explicit statements, all to that effect, out of their very own creeds and confessions. That is also probably why they really don't want to mention it, as well. What we have factually demonstrated from the actual content in the Textus Receptus, original language, of the Book of Revelation, is that there are numerous battles throughout the span of history that are prophesied in Revelation, which Jesuit futurism all falsely conflates into a single battle, which it falsely calls the tribulation period, and which John overtly states he is already in, and he never once states it is 7 years. The claim of a future 7-year tribulation period is fully fabricated out of thin air. That was an attempt to squeeze all the prophetic events into a very small period, far away at the end of time, in which the historic Roman papacy could have nothing to do with. We have also demonstrated that the prophecies in Revelation occur over the span of numerous ages and periods of history, detailed by the very language of the prophecies themselves, including references to geographies, numerous synchronistic geological and atmospheric events, the progressive evolution of legal codes, customs and norms, and the progressive and yet very historically dated military equipment and technology, and even the astronomical events in the heavens, which would coincide the very real events in history. We have also factually demonstrated from the actual content in the Textus Receptus, original language, of the Book of Revelation, that John's description of the Antichrists and the coming Antichrist in the city of Ephesus was a completely known reference to a rogue branch of Gentile Christians who called themselves apostolic, but made an open practice of lying about their identity with the purpose of actually replacing what was really the apostolic New Covenant observed in Passover. John gave them the name of Nicolaitans, after their inordinate affection for an early Gentile proselyte that became an apostate from Antioch, referred to as Saint Nicholas. And contrary to the unbiblical claim by Rome, Nicolaitans had all gone extinct, John is prophesying their very future collaboration with the Roman Empire, and the eventual judgment of God upon that same empire that this alliance will bring into the world. And that the coming of 666, the throne of the beast, the mark of the beast, and the false prophet, which calls down fire from heaven in a fake miracle, are all known historical events, which completely happened, as was prophesied, and the origin of which would all be John's references to the future work of the Nicolaitans, which he repeatedly mentioned in the very beginning of his book, setting the entire context for everything that he prophesied in the following 19 chapters to come. And we have also factually demonstrated from the actual content in the Textus Receptus, original language, of the Book of Revelation, that the text in verse 12 is mistranslated, either by ignorance or by intentional design, to translate as the phrase, quote, "the kings of the east," end quote. A translation that clearly cloaks the main geographical reference to the actual prophecy itself, which was Anatolia. Not China or Russia. It was Anatolia. And Anatolia was a nation-state empire that was fully known in history from the historic occurrence of Armageddon. And any preacher which has ever really looked at the actual text in verse 12 fully knows Anatolia is the reference that is used in the Greek text there. It must be translated into something else to actually miss it. We have also shown there will be no Armageddon, because Armageddon has already fully happened and was prophesied hundreds of years in advance of the event. So you really couldn't honestly just miss that either. There will be no coming Antichrist, because that too has already happened and was fully known by the founders of every historic Christian denomination on the earth. So you really couldn't just miss that. And there is no reference to either China or Russia anywhere in sight of these actual texts, which anyone who has studied these texts will obviously see as well. And again, you can't really just miss that detail either. And we have additionally factually demonstrated from the actual content in the Textus Receptus, original language, of the Book of Revelation, that the first, second, third and fourth saucer judgments are also all very obvious past and current historic events, we are now seeing with our very own eyes, in our present-day world, on a daily basis. So you can't really miss that. And, you have seen in this video, that the prophecy in the sixth saucer judgment, is also in the process of already being completely fulfilled in our present day, and which we are now seeing, on a daily basis, also with our very own eyes. So nobody, including Muslims, can actually miss that. Which means, the Antichrist, according to God in heaven, is clearly already here, and has been, for more decades than any one person ever lives. And finally, we have also, factually demonstrated, from the actual content, in the Textus Receptus's, original language, of the Book of Revelation, that Jesuit futurism is a form of brainwashing or indoctrination, designed to intentionally hide from the public, the very existence and identity of the Antichrist. And the effect of accepting or embracing that delusion, is very far, from being inconsequential, as you are constantly told. But rather, John states explicitly, that collusion with the Antichrist results in devil worship, stated in verse 13 and 14, and the promise of damnation, in chapter 14, verse 10. Which no one, can just accidentally miss, that little detail either. So eschatology, is not simply, a minor disagreement, or a matter of personal opinion or preference, or just personal interpretation, as all the guilty will attempt to argue. John makes it very clear, it is at the core, of what John considers, the coming future Nicolaitan spiritual crimes and atrocities, and spiritually or theologically colluding with our works, which he repeatedly calls for repentance from, is following in the footsteps of the Antichrist. You may not like it, and you may not agree with it, but if you want to know, what is really in the text in Revelation, that is exactly, what John put there, as his prophecy, concerning the future. And those are the very truths, that literally is, what billions of dollars, have been spent on, trying to erase and obfuscate, from public view, or knowledge. And now, you know why. And the tragedy may be, that your local religious leader, may not even be aware, that not only do these truths, actually exist in the Bible, but also, as the very religious leader, that they are unwittingly playing a critical role, in serving as a public disinformationist, in return for nothing more, than a cheap paycheck, from blood money. That, in the end, may even be a threat, to the very salvation, that they publicly claim, to believe in. In the next video, we will cover the historical fulfillment of the seventh saucer judgment, in chapter 16. Thank you for watching.